I need 4 days for my father's funeral, I said, my voice steadier than the trembling in my chest. Vivian from HR looked up at me over her computer screen. The air conditioning hummed too loudly in the silence that followed. That's not possible right now. You're aware we're in the middle of the Norlin integration. She adjusted her glasses, eyes already drifting back to her monitor. You can take 2 days, maximum. The team needs you here. My father died yesterday. The words felt strange in my mouth, still unreal. The funeral is in Michigan. 2 days isn't enough time to even get there and back. I understand this is difficult, but we're at a critical juncture. Her tone suggested she understood nothing. Perhaps you could attend virtually. Many families are doing that now. I stared at her, waiting for some flicker of humanity. When none came, I said, I need to be there in person. He raised me alone after my mom died. I'm his only family. Vivian sighed, the kind reserved for inconvenient children. Listen, I don't make the rules. We're short-staffed, and your role is essential right now. You'll need to choose between work and family. That's just the reality. Something crystallized inside me in that moment. 3 years of solving every technical emergency, rebuilding systems no one else understood, documenting processes only I could navigate, all reduced to this. I see, I said quietly. That was yesterday. My name is Zara, I'm 32, and until this morning, I was the systems integration specialist at a financial technology firm that handles over $40 million in client assets. My job was solving problems no one else could, connecting disparate systems, creating documentation, and building workflows that kept everything running. Before I go any further, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're watching from? I want to know how far this story reaches. And if you've ever had someone treat your grief like an inconvenience, hit that like button. We need to know we're not alone in these moments. Anyway, when my phone rang 2 days ago with news about my dad, Ellis, I was in the middle of finalizing the database migration that would become central to this story. He'd had a sudden heart attack in his woodworking shop. The neighbor found him. By the time I got the call, he was already gone. Dad had raised me by himself since I was 8, when Mom died from cancer. He taught high school science for 30 years, coached my debate team, and learned to braid hair from YouTube tutorials so I wouldn't feel different from the other girls. When I got my first computer, he sat beside me for hours while I showed him everything I was learning, pretending to understand even when I knew he was lost. You've got a mind like a catalog, he'd tell me. You remember everything. That quality made me invaluable at work. I remembered every client preference, every system quirk, every workaround needed when the expensive software inevitably failed. For 3 years, I'd been the company's memory. It started innocently creating documentation because nobody else would. Spreadsheets tracking client communication preferences, databases of recurring issues and solutions, step-by-step guides for processes only I understood. My boss, Halden, called it Zara's brain, the shared drive where I stored everything. Why pay for expensive knowledge management systems when we have Zara? He'd joke during meetings. Except it wasn't really a joke. They'd declined my requests for proper documentation software twice. So I built my own systems, my own archives. Not for any sinister purpose. I genuinely wanted to solve problems. After Vivian's dismissal of my bereavement request, I walked back to my desk in a fog. Cameron from accounting asked if I was okay. I nodded mechanically. That night in my apartment, I stared at my ceiling, thinking about Dad, about the wooden box he'd made for my childhood treasures that still sat on my bookshelf, about how no one from work would be at his funeral because I barely mentioned my personal life there, about how they couldn't spare me for 4 days to say goodbye to the person who mattered most. At 2 a.m., I opened my laptop. I hadn't planned what happened next. Not really. But as I logged into our company systems remotely, something I did during emergencies, weekends, vacations, a clarity washed over me. For 3 years, I'd created the most comprehensive archive of institutional knowledge imaginable. Client communication histories, undocumented API connections, manual processes that kept millions flowing, password-protected spreadsheets with notes on executive preferences. I'd been the solution to their refusal to invest in proper systems. My fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. I began downloading everything, not company data or client information, but my documentation, my guides, my notes, the maps I'd created of their broken systems. By dawn, I had extracted 3 years of institutional knowledge. I encrypted everything and moved it to my personal cloud storage. Then I systematically removed it all from the company drives, leaving only basic files that anyone would expect to find. My resignation email was simple. Effective immediately. All institutional knowledge I've compiled over 3 years has been relocated to ensure continuity during my personal transition. I included nothing else. No explanation, no 2 weeks' notice, nothing about my father. They hadn't earned that context. Then I shut my laptop, packed a bag, and caught the first flight to Michigan. I turned off my phone during the flight. When I landed and powered it back on, there were 17 missed calls. 9 from Halden, 5 from Vivian, 3 from numbers I didn't recognize. The voicemails escalated in panic. Zara, call me immediately. We need to discuss your email. Halden, sounding confused. This is highly unprofessional. Return our calls now. Vivian, cold as ever. Please call back urgently. The Norland migration is failing and no one can find your documentation. Cameron, stressed. Whatever you want, we can discuss it. Just call back. Halden again, anxiety creeping in. I didn't call. Instead, I rented a car and drove to my childhood home to begin sorting through Dad's belongings. The small brick house looked exactly as it had during my last visit 3 months ago, except now it felt hollow. My phone kept buzzing. Emails poured in. Text messages multiplied. By evening, I received an email from Halden marked Urgent Meeting Request, with Vivian and our company's legal counsel copied. They wanted a video call to discuss the situation and your father's funeral arrangements. How interesting that my father's funeral suddenly warranted discussion. I agreed to the call, scheduling it during what would have been my lunch break the next day. Then I silenced my phone again and continued sorting through old photographs of Dad and me. The next morning, I sat at Dad's kitchen table with my laptop open, waiting for their call. When the video connected, I saw Halden, Vivian, and a woman I recognized as Meredith from legal, all crowded around a conference room table. Zara, thank you for joining, Halden began, his usual confidence noticeably diminished. First, let me express our condolences about your father. I nodded but said nothing. We're concerned about your abrupt resignation and the situation with company materials, he continued. I didn't take any company materials, I replied calmly. I removed my personal documentation, the systems I built because proper ones were never approved, the workflows I mapped, the guides I wrote on my own initiative. Those were created during company time, Meredith interjected. Yes, created by me to do my job effectively because the resources I requested were denied. 3 times. I kept my voice even. Nothing I removed contains client data or proprietary information. Just the instruction manuals I wrote. Vivian leaned forward. The Norland integration is falling apart. The monthly reports are due in 2 days, and the queries you built aren't working. Client communications are in disarray. That sounds stressful, I said. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Zara, Halden finally said, we're prepared to discuss your bereavement leave. 4 days is absolutely reasonable. We can hold your position. I already resigned, I interrupted. We're willing to disregard that email given the circumstances, Vivian said quickly. Grief can cause impulsive decisions. I looked at them through my screen. 3 people who'd never seen me as more than a function, a resource to be optimized. 2 days ago, you told me to choose between work and family, I said, looking directly at Vivian. I've made my choice. Please be reasonable, Halden pleaded. The Norland presentation is tomorrow. We can't access half the systems without your documentation. That's unfortunate, I replied. What do you want? Vivian asked bluntly. A raise? More vacation time? What will it take to resolve this situation immediately? I felt a strange calm as I realized they still didn't understand. They thought this was a negotiation tactic. This isn't about leverage, I told them. You made it clear where I stood in the company's priorities. I'm simply respecting that clarity by removing myself from the equation. We're prepared to offer you a senior position with a 30% salary increase and flexible work arrangements, Halden said desperately. Just help us through the next 2 weeks. I looked down at the table where a stack of sympathy cards from Dad's former students and colleagues sat. People who valued him. People who understood what mattered. My father's funeral is on Thursday, I said. I'll be busy until next Monday dealing with his estate. After that, I'd be willing to consult at $300 per hour with a minimum engagement of 20 hours per week to help transition my knowledge. My first availability would be next Tuesday. Their faces registered shock at the figure, nearly triple my effective hourly rate. That's extortionate, Vivian sputtered. No, I corrected her. That's the market rate for emergency specialized consulting when organizations find themselves without critical institutional knowledge. You can take it or leave it. This borders on extortion, Meredith warned. I've made no threats. I've taken no company data. I've simply resigned and removed my personal documentation, I said. Check your employment contracts. There's no clause requiring employees to leave behind personal notes or systems they've created to compensate for inadequate resources. I watched them exchange glances, knowing Meredith had already verified this or she wouldn't be negotiating. 10 hours, Halden countered. 10 hours at your consultant rate to get us through the Norlin presentation. 20 hours minimum engagement, payable in advance, I repeated. I'm not interested in negotiating. You decide if the knowledge is worth the cost. Without waiting for a response, I added, I need to go now. The funeral home is waiting for me to select my father's casket. You know how important these family matters are. I disconnected before they could respond. As I sat in Dad's quiet kitchen, surrounded by his life's mementos, something shifted inside me. The hurt remained, but alongside it grew something else, a recognition of my own worth they had never acknowledged. My phone immediately rang again. Halden's number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened. We'll agree to your terms, his voice said tightly. Send your consulting contract and payment details. We need you on a call by 5 p.m. today. I put my phone down and closed my eyes. In the quiet of Dad's house, I could almost hear him saying what he told me when I was hesitating about leaving for college. Sometimes people only understand your value when they feel your absence. I didn't send a contract that afternoon, or that evening. Instead, I visited the funeral home, picked out a simple wooden casket that reminded me of Dad's woodworking, and sat in his workshop running my fingers over his tools. Let me tell you something about grief. It's not linear. It comes in waves. Sometimes when you're standing in line at a coffee shop. Sometimes when you're holding your father's favorite flannel shirt, breathing in what's left of his scent. That day, it hit me as I found a small wooden pendant he'd been working on with my initials carved into it. An unfinished gift. My phone kept buzzing with increasingly desperate messages. The Norlin presentation is falling apart. Legal is prepared to approve your contract immediately. Please respond ASAP. I silenced them all and continued sorting through Dad's belongings. The funeral was still 2 days away. I had time. On Thursday morning, I stood in the small chapel where both my parents' funerals had now been held. Dad's colleagues filled half the room, science teachers who'd worked alongside him for decades, former students who'd become teachers themselves, neighbors who'd checked on him regularly after I moved away. I recognized every face. As people shared stories about how Ellis had touched their lives, I thought about what creates a meaningful legacy. It isn't the hours worked or deadlines met. It's the humans you help along the way. After the service, my old debate team coach, Ms. Wynne, hugged me tightly. Your father was so proud of you, she said. He told everyone about your work, though I don't think he ever quite understood what you actually did. I laughed through my tears. He tried so hard to get it. He'd ask me to explain that computer thing over and over. That was Ellis, she smiled. He believed in understanding things, even when they didn't come easily to him. As everyone left, I stood alone at his grave, thinking about understanding, how some people try so hard to understand others, while some never bother to try at all. That evening, I finally sent my consulting contract. 4 pages of detailed terms, including a clause specifying all interaction would occur during business hours only, with 24-hour advance scheduling required for any calls or meetings. I also included a knowledge transfer fee of $5,000 in addition to my hourly rate. They signed it within the hour and sent the first payment. The next morning, Friday, I joined a video call with the Norland team. Their presentation had been postponed to Monday, an embarrassing but necessary delay they'd had to request from their potential $3.8 million client. "Thank you for joining us, Zara," Halden said, visible relief in his expression. "We've got the whole team here." The screen showed 12 faces, including several I'd never seen before, likely external consultants they'd panic hired. "I've reviewed what you've prepared so far," I said professionally. "We have significant gaps to address before Monday." For the next 3 hours, I methodically walked them through the missing elements of their presentation. I identified the broken database connections, explained which tables needed to be joined to generate the correct reports, and created a simplified guide for the temporary tech team. Halden kept trying to rush me. "Can we skip ahead to the client portal section? That's most urgent." "Everything is connected," I replied calmly. "If you don't understand the database structure, the portal functions won't make sense. I'm being thorough because that's what you're paying for." By the end of the call, they had enough to cobble together a functional presentation. Not their best work, but enough to avoid complete disaster. "We'll need you on standby Monday during the actual presentation," Vivian said. "Not as a request, but as an expectation." "That's not in our agreement," I responded. "Monday I'll be meeting with Dad's attorney to handle his estate. I can schedule 2 hours on Tuesday morning." "But if something goes wrong during the presentation," Halden began. "Then you'll handle it with the information I've provided," I finished for him. That's what the knowledge transfer fee covered. The weekend passed quietly as I continued sorting through Dad's house. Each drawer contained memories, birthday cards I'd made him, scientific journals with his notes in the margins, recipe cards in my mother's handwriting that he'd kept all these years. On Monday, while they were giving their presentation, I met with Dad's attorney. The house was paid off. There was a modest life insurance policy. His pension would end, but he'd left enough for me to take some time to figure out my next steps. "He was always very careful with money," the attorney noted. "Wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of." Unlike some people, I thought. Tuesday morning, I logged on to my final consulting call with the company. Their faces told me everything I needed to know before anyone spoke. "The presentation was challenging," Halden admitted. "We made it through, but there were significant issues with the demonstration portion." "Did you secure the contract?" I asked directly. "Norland has concerns," Vivian said tightly. "They're giving us 2 weeks to address the functionality problems before making their decision." I nodded. "That seems reasonable. What specifically do you need from me today?" For the next 2 hours, I answered their questions with professional detachment. I created additional documentation, explained system connections, and provided clear steps for their new team to follow. As our scheduled time neared its end, Halden cleared his throat. "Zara, we'd like to discuss your return to the company." I raised an eyebrow. "My return?" "Yes," he continued. "We're prepared to offer you a Director of Knowledge Systems position. It would include a team of 3, a 50% salary increase, remote work options, and a seat on the executive committee." I noticed Vivian's tight smile. This hadn't been her idea. "That's quite a change from denying 4 days of bereavement leave," I observed. Vivian shifted uncomfortably. "We've recognized there were institutional failures in how we handled your request." "What's fascinating," I said, leaning closer to my camera, "is that it took a financial threat for that recognition to occur. Not human decency, not company loyalty, not 3 years of solving every problem thrown at me, just the risk of losing money." "That's not entirely fair," Halden protested weakly. "Isn't it?" I looked at each face on my screen. "For 3 years, I asked for proper knowledge management systems. Denied. I requested additional staff to document our processes. Denied. I built workarounds using my own initiative, and instead of recognizing that as a systemic problem, you called it Zara's brain and considered it solved." No one spoke. Here's what I learned watching my father build relationships with students for 30 years. I continued. People stay where they're valued, not just compensated. They contribute to communities that see them as humans, not functions. I took a breath. I appreciate the offer, but I'll be declining. Our consulting arrangement ends today, as contracted. Please reconsider, Halden said quickly. We can negotiate any terms you want. This isn't about terms, I explained. It's about fundamental values. You showed me yours when it mattered most. I believed you. What about your documentation? Vivian asked, her voice tight. Will you be returning the materials you removed? I smiled slightly. I've provided everything needed for the Norland project as agreed. The rest of my documentation remains my intellectual property, as your legal team has confirmed. Consider it a lesson in valuing institutional knowledge before it walks out the door. Meredith from legal nodded almost imperceptibly. She knew I was right. This is incredibly unprofessional, Vivian snapped, finally breaking. No. I corrected her gently. Unprofessional is telling someone their parent's funeral is an inconvenience. What I'm doing is setting boundaries around my value. There's a difference. As our call time expired, I said my final words to them. I genuinely wish you all well. I hope whoever replaces me receives the support and resources I requested. And I hope the next time someone needs to bury their father, you remember this moment. I disconnected the call. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Cameron in accounting. Norland had declined to sign with the company. The projected $3.8 million deal had fallen through. 3 other clients were reviewing their contracts due to service concerns. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected, just a quiet certainty that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are necessary teachers. A month after Dad's funeral, I accepted a position with a smaller tech firm, one whose first question in the interview was about my father, after seeing the gap in my employment. When I explained the circumstances, the CEO nodded and said, "Take all the time you need before starting. Family comes first here, always." I later learned that Vivian had been reassigned to a non-management role. The company had hired a knowledge management consultant and implemented many of the systems I'd requested years ago. Too late for me, but perhaps not for those who remained. 6 months later, as I settled into my new role, I received a LinkedIn message from Halden. I owe you an apology, not just for how things ended, but for taking your contributions for granted all along. You were right. We didn't value the human, only the function. I'm trying to change that in my new department. The company lost 4 major clients after you left. They're still recovering. I think about your father often, strangely enough. A man I never met who raised someone with such clarity of purpose. He must have been remarkable. I sat with that message for a long time before replying. He was. Thank you for recognizing that. I wish you well, Halden. That night, I placed the wooden pendant my father had been making, the one with my initials, on my desk at home. I'd finished sanding it myself, applied the same oil finish he would have used. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't some elaborate revenge scheme. Sometimes it's simply removing yourself from environments that don't value you, taking your worth with you, and letting the consequences unfold naturally. The company had denied me 4 days to bury my father, and in return, I took something much more valuable, the knowledge they'd never bothered to properly value until it was gone. If you're watching this and you're in a place where your humanity comes second to your productivity, know that you have more power than you realize. Your knowledge, your skills, your presence, these have value beyond what's reflected in your paycheck. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself the way I did, drop a comment below. I want to hear your story too. Because in the end, that's what matters most. Not the work we produce, but the stories we share, the boundaries we defend, and the values we uphold when it matters most.